The stars stretched across the dark sky like scattered diamonds, and in the midst of that infinite blackness floated the grand capital of the Empress. The city was vast, with towers that shimmered in soft silver light and bridges that seemed to float between them. Even from orbit, one could see the beauty of the place, the careful precision of every line and curve. Yet, despite all its magnificence, there was a weight upon it, a shadow that no light could erase. Inside the central palace, the Empress walked slowly through the long corridors. Her robe, heavy with the threads of centuries-old tradition, swept softly along the polished floor. Her eyes, the color of molten gold, looked empty, though nothing could escape the brilliance of her gaze. For years, she had ruled an empire that stretched across countless worlds, but even her power could not erase the pain she carried. Her daughters had been lost long ago, taken by circumstances no one dared speak of. They had vanished into the depths of space, and with them went the last trace of her happiness. Every corner of the palace reminded her of them. Portraits hung in the halls, untouched by time, showing young faces bright with life and laughter. Toys and personal belongings remained exactly as they had been, frozen in memory. The Empress had learned to hide her grief in public, to present a face of unshakable authority. But in the solitude of her private chambers, she allowed herself to feel the emptiness. The stars outside seemed endless and cruel, reflecting the vast distance that separated her from what she had lost. Her advisors approached cautiously, their voices measured and respectful. "Your Majesty," one said, bowing slightly, "the reports from the outer sectors remain unchanged. No trace of the daughters has been found. The search continues." The Empress nodded without speaking. She had heard these words for years, and each repetition was a reminder of her failure. She had trusted the galaxy to keep her children safe, and the galaxy had failed her. Yet, even in this deep despair, a flicker of hope remained buried somewhere in her heart, a hope that she refused to acknowledge, for fear it might die as it always had. That flicker became impossible to ignore when the sensors of the palace detected something unprecedented. A small, unassuming vessel appeared at the edge of the orbit. Its design was unlike anything the Empress had ever seen. Sleek, functional, with no decorative embellishments, it moved with an effortless grace that made it seem almost alive. Alarm systems engaged, and the palace buzzed with activity. Guards and scientists rushed to the observation decks. Messages were sent to the vessel, but there was no response for several minutes. When finally a voice came through the communication channel, it was calm, steady, and unmistakably human. "I have your daughters," the voice said simply. "They are aboard my ship. They are alive." The hall fell silent. The Empress's heart seemed to stop. Alive. After all these years, after all the searching, after every dark hope that had turned to despair, her daughters were alive. But how? How could a human, a creature her species had always considered chaotic and primitive, accomplish something that all the Empire's fleets and fleets of sensors could not? The Empress called her council immediately. Ambassadors, generals, and scholars crowded into the central chamber. Every eye was fixed on the holographic display of the human vessel hovering at the edge of the planet's orbit. Murmurs filled the room. Half disbelief, half fear. "The human claims to have found them?" one general asked, his voice tight. "Yes," another replied, shaking his head. "But how is this possible? Humans do not have the technology, the navigation, the reach. They have done the impossible," the Empress said softly, though no one dared to look directly at her. "We will see for ourselves." She ordered the gates to the docking bay opened. The human's vessel descended with careful precision, landing on the wide platform in the center of the city. The air shimmered with energy from the engines, but the craft made no noise beyond a soft hum. Its doors opened, revealing the figure inside. The human was ordinary in appearance, unarmored and unarmed. He stepped forward with deliberate calm, his eyes scanning the assembled crowd with quiet confidence. He carried no weapons, no advanced alien devices, only the two small figures that followed him. The daughters. They were older now, no longer the children whose laughter haunted the Empress's dreams. Time had changed them, given them experiences she could not imagine. Yet, even as they approached, she recognized them instantly. Their faces held traces of her own features, the curve of a cheek, the set of a jaw, and the moment their eyes met hers, the years of distance collapsed into nothing. Tears she had not allowed herself to shed began to fall. The Empress took slow, careful steps toward them, each movement weighed down by disbelief and wonder. "My daughters," she whispered, her voice breaking. The human bowed slightly. "They are safe, Your Majesty. I kept them out of harm's way, and I have brought them home, as you wished." There was something about his calm certainty that unsettled the court. This human, who should have been helpless and limited, had done what countless fleets of alien ships could not. He had defied the impossible with nothing but courage, intelligence, and persistence. The daughters stepped forward. One of them, the older by a few minutes, reached for her mother's hand. "Mother," she said softly, "it's really you. We thought we would never see you again." The Empress knelt before them, ignoring protocol and tradition. For the first time in years, she let herself feel the fullness of her joy and relief. She held them close, afraid to let go, afraid that this miracle might vanish if she dared to breathe too freely. The human watched quietly from a short distance. He said nothing, allowed the reunion to unfold naturally, but there was a subtle air of pride about him. Not pride of conquest or dominance, but pride of accomplishment, of a promise kept. He had succeeded where all others had failed. The court, however, was not as easily convinced. Some ministers whispered among themselves, eyes narrowed, questioning how a human could have achieved this. Others marveled openly, their skepticism giving way to awe. The Empress noticed the tension, but chose to ignore it for the moment. Her daughters were here. That was all that mattered. Yet even as she embraced them, questions bubbled in her mind. How had the human found them? Where had they been kept all these years? What trials had they endured, and what had changed them? She knew the answers would not come easily, and she also knew that the human had brought more than just her daughters. He had brought new knowledge, a perspective that the Empire had never encountered before.
Later, in a private chamber, the human spoke with the Empress.
He explained in careful detail how he had tracked the daughters across galaxies, navigating hazards that would have destroyed ordinary vessels. He described civilizations and cultures far different from her own, the cleverness of survival he had relied upon, and the unwavering determination that drove him forward when all hope seemed lost. The Empress listened, fascinated. The human's methods were unconventional, often unpredictable, and utterly unlike anything her advisors would have considered. She realized that this creature, so small, so seemingly fragile in comparison to the grandeur of her empire, possessed qualities she had long admired, but never expected to see in a single being: courage, creativity, and a relentless desire to protect life. By the time the human had finished speaking, night had fallen over the capital. The stars outside were reflected in the palace's crystal windows, endless points of light that mirrored the wonder and uncertainty of the moment. The Empress sat quietly, her daughters at her side, and pondered what this meant for the future. The human had entered her empire without permission, defied her expectations, and yet, in doing so, he had changed everything. She realized with a mixture of awe and apprehension that the universe was far larger than her traditions and rules could contain. And now, humanity had a place within it, not as conquerors, but as equals, as beings capable of feats even the most advanced alien technology could not achieve. The parting words of the human echoed in her mind as he prepared to leave the palace. "They are safe now, Your Majesty. And remember, sometimes the smallest beings can make the largest difference." The Empress watched him depart, a strange combination of gratitude and curiosity swelling within her. Her daughters were home, but the presence of this human, so clever, so fearless, so different, had opened a door to something entirely new. She did not yet know where it would lead, but she understood that her empire, her daughters, and even she herself would never be the same. And somewhere deep within, a spark of hope began to grow. A hope that even in the vastness of the galaxy, humanity's ingenuity, courage, and persistence could change the course of history. The stars outside shimmered with possibilities, and the Empress knew that the journey was only just beginning. The return of the daughters had caused ripples that spread through the empire like sunlight across water. The streets of the capital, usually orderly and quiet, were alive with whispers. Citizens, ambassadors, and scholars alike talked of the human who had achieved the impossible. Some admired him. Others feared what his presence might mean. Rumors swirled in every corner, growing taller and stranger with each retelling. In the grand halls of the palace, the Empress walked alongside her daughters. Their hands brushed against hers lightly, and she could feel the pulse of life that she had thought lost forever. Yet, even in the joy of reunion, a shadow of caution lingered. Her daughters were changed, yes, but so too was the Empire. The human had not just returned them. He had opened a door to possibilities that could challenge centuries of tradition. The older daughter, Neria, had grown thoughtful during their journey. Her experiences beyond the Empire had shaped her into someone perceptive and resilient. She glanced at the council chambers where ministers argued quietly over the human's place in the Empire. "Mother," she said softly, "they do not understand him."
"They cannot see what he has done."
The Empress nodded. "Perhaps, but understanding is not always immediate. We must give them time and guidance." Meanwhile, the human had begun to explore the Empire's technology and knowledge archives. He walked through the tall halls filled with glowing panels and intricate machinery, his human hands tracing patterns of energy and logic. Where the alien saw static rules, he saw possibility. He repaired old navigation instruments that had long been considered beyond repair. He discovered hidden messages in ancient data logs and interpreted them in ways the scholars had never imagined. When the Empress observed him, she realized he worked not with arrogance, but with patience. He listened carefully, asked questions, and tested possibilities with careful thought. He did not demand respect. He earned it through action. That was something alien leaders had rarely seen in humans, or perhaps in anyone. Despite these successes, not everyone welcomed the human. Some ministers whispered in shattered halls. "A human," one said, "returns our lost heirs, and now moves through our empire as if it belongs to him. What does he want in return? Will he demand loyalty, resources, or influence over our decisions?" Another countered, shaking his head. "Perhaps he asks for nothing but to do what is right, but can we trust such beings? Their species is unpredictable, chaotic. One act of kindness today could be the spark of rebellion tomorrow." The Empress overheard these words, but she did not intervene immediately. She understood the fear of the unfamiliar. But she also knew that this human's presence was teaching the Empire a lesson more valuable than any weapon or law. That intelligence, courage, and moral clarity could shape the future in ways brute force never could. The daughters were discovering this lesson as well. They had seen the human navigate unfamiliar worlds, mediate conflicts, and survive in ways that often defied logic. Now, back in their home empire, they could see how alien politics and pride sometimes blinded their leaders to solutions. They watched quietly, absorbing every moment, ready to act when the time was right. One day, the Empress called the human to her private study. The room was lined with tall windows, through which the lights of the capital reflected like a river of stars. "You have done much already," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I must ask, why? Why risk so much to return my daughters? What drives you?" The human met her gaze without hesitation. "Because it was right," he said simply.
They were lost, and I could help. That is all.
I do not seek power or recognition. I wanted to make a difference, to protect life and family wherever I could. The Empress studied him, seeing the truth in his words. There was no hidden agenda, no desire for gain. Just determination and integrity. Then you are unlike anyone I have known, she said softly. Perhaps unlike anyone in this galaxy. He nodded. I do what I can. Sometimes that is enough. Meanwhile, tensions continued to simmer in the council chambers. Some factions saw the human as a tool, a means to gain favor or power. Others saw him as a threat, a wild card that might disrupt the careful balance of the empire. Each whispered meeting, each quiet accusation, each nervous glance carried the potential for unrest. The daughters, sensing the growing unease, decided to act subtly. They had grown wise beyond their years, not only through experience, but through survival in distant worlds. Neria suggested solutions to old disputes that had lingered for decades. She proposed methods to strengthen trade with neighboring systems, using strategies she had learned from human ingenuity. Her younger sister, Lyra, focused on education and communication, encouraging scholars to think creatively rather than follow rigid rules. The Empress watched with a mixture of pride and surprise. Her daughters were changing the empire, not through force, but through insight and understanding. And they were doing it alongside the human, who seemed to inspire ideas without demanding attention. It was during a gathering of scholars that the human's abilities became most apparent. A device in the archives had been malfunctioning for decades, and many had declared it useless. The human studied the device, turning it over in his hands, adjusting settings no one had dared touch. With a small, careful adjustment, the machine whirred to life, projecting streams of data across the chamber. Gasps filled the room. The scholars realized that they had overlooked a simple principle, a principle that the human had intuitively applied. Where their methods were bound by tradition, he had relied on observation, creativity, and logic. The Empress smiled quietly. This was exactly what she had feared and hoped for. The human's influence was subtle, but undeniable. As the days passed, the human and the daughters worked together to address challenges the Empire had long ignored. They improved communication networks, restored lost knowledge, and found solutions to logistical problems that had plagued entire sectors. Citizens began to take notice, speaking quietly of the human's cleverness and the daughter's wisdom. Slowly, the Empire's attitude began to shift, but not everyone accepted this change. A rival faction of ministers grew restless. They convened in secret, whispering of human overreach and the potential for rebellion.
We cannot allow a single human to wield so much influence,
one said. He is an outsider. He does not understand our ways. If we let this continue, he may reshape the empire to his liking. They began plotting to discredit him, spreading rumors that his actions were manipulative or dangerous. Yet the human remained calm, addressing problems as they arose, never engaging in their political games. The daughters, learning from his example, used clever reasoning to counter these attempts without confrontation. The Empress watched these interactions closely, realizing that the human was teaching her daughters as much as the Empire. One evening, as the three walked through the palace gardens, Neria turned to the human.
"Why do you not fight them?" she asked. "They speak against you openly, and yet you do nothing to stop them."
He smiled gently. Because strength is not always about fighting. Sometimes it is about showing what can be done without harming anyone. Sometimes the best victory is one that no one can resist admiring.
You make it look easy, but it is not easy. They will not give up so soon. No, he admitted.
But people change when they see results. They see what is possible. That is more powerful than words or force.
The Empress overheard their conversation from a distance.
She realized he was teaching a lesson that had been missing in her empire for centuries. Strength intelligence, and courage could coexist with empathy and wisdom. Perhaps this human, so different from her own people, had returned her daughters not only to her arms, but to a future she had never dared imagine. The council, aware of the growing support for the human and the daughters, became increasingly cautious. Every action they took was scrutinized, every suggestion measured against the results the human had already achieved. Slowly, grudging respect began to replace suspicion. Scholars praised his insights, citizens celebrated the changes he inspired, and even the rival ministers began to realize that he could not be ignored. By the time the first month of their return had passed, the empire had shifted subtly, but irrevocably. Old problems had solutions, old disputes had compromises, and the human's presence had sparked a new way of thinking. The Empress walked through the halls, her daughters beside her, feeling hope that had not existed in decades. Yet she knew this was only the beginning. The universe beyond her borders was vast and full of challenges. She had seen that humans could achieve incredible feats, but she also understood that change could create enemies. The rival faction was not gone, only cautious. The human had proven his ingenuity, but the test of his influence was far from over. For now, though, there was progress. The daughters were safe, the empire was growing stronger, and the human's quiet, clever guidance was opening doors to new possibilities. The Empress allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that the seeds of transformation had been planted, and that the future might be brighter than she had ever dared imagine. And somewhere in the stars beyond, the human starship waited. A reminder that the universe was full of surprises, and that sometimes the most extraordinary beings were the ones no one expected. The empire had begun to change. The influence of the human, though subtle, was undeniable. Every day, more citizens, scholars, and even some ministers began to notice that solutions arrived faster, conflicts were resolved more peacefully, and innovation thrived. Yet not everyone embraced this new era. The rival faction grew restless, watching as their power seemed to slip through their fingers, replaced by admiration for the human and the daughters. The Empress observed the growing tension carefully. She knew that the human's cleverness could not be doubted, and the daughter's wisdom only added to his impact. But she also understood that the empire valued strength and strategy above all else. Respect must be earned, not merely admired. And so, she decided to set a trial, not to punish or test for arrogance, but to challenge the human's intelligence, ingenuity, and ability to navigate complexities her empire had long considered insurmountable. In the central chamber, the human stood quietly as the Empress addressed him. Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority. "You have accomplished much already," she said. "Yet to truly serve this empire, you must demonstrate not only cleverness, but understanding of our ways and the ability to solve a challenge that has confounded us for decades. You will face the trial of knowledge and strategy." The human tilted his head slightly.
"I will do my best, Your Majesty."
The Empress motioned to a large display in the center of the chamber. It projected a complex, interconnected network of systems, planetary logistics, communication channels, and trade routes that had been failing for years. The trial was simple to describe, but nearly impossible to solve. Reorganize and optimize the Empire's network without disrupting ongoing operations, identify hidden weaknesses, and propose improvements that would endure for generations. The room filled with murmurs. Many ministers had attempted similar solutions before, only to fail. Scholars had declared parts of the system irreparable, and yet the human approached it with calm determination. He studied the network, tracing the paths with his fingers. He did not rush. He observed, questioned, and analyzed, identifying patterns and connections that had been overlooked for centuries. Where the Empire saw rigid rules, he saw flexible possibilities. Where the minister saw obstacles, he saw opportunities for clever adjustments. The daughters assisted him, each contributing what they had learned during their years away from the Empire. Neria applied strategic insight, imagining how each planet could better interact with the others. Lyra focused on communication, ensuring that no system would become isolated or misunderstood. Together, The human and the daughters approached the challenge not as a set of rules to follow, but as a puzzle to understand and reshape. Meanwhile, the rival faction worked quietly behind the scenes. They whispered in the corridors, spreading doubts and questioning the humans' methods. "He is clever," one minister said to another, "but he does not understand the consequences of our traditions. A single error could collapse our networks."
We must watch him closely. If he succeeds, the Empire may owe him more than we are willing to give.
He cannot be allowed to shape our future unchecked. The human remained aware of the scrutiny, but did not react with fear or anger. Instead, he focused on the challenge itself, confident that honest work and careful reasoning would speak louder than accusations. He tested each idea, running simulations that accounted for variables the Empire had ignored. He adjusted trade schedules, communication channels, and planetary resource management, all without disrupting the ongoing flow of daily life. Days passed, and the Empress watched in silent awe. The humans' methods were unconventional, often counterintuitive, but remarkably effective. Ministers who had doubted him could not help but admire the results. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to accept that he was achieving what had been declared impossible. The daughters observed quietly, learning from his approach. They noticed that he asked questions, challenged assumptions, and remained patient even when progress seemed slow. He did not seek recognition or control. He sought understanding and improvement. One afternoon, Nerea asked him, "Why do you not simply follow their rules? Why create your own path? Rules are important, but they are not perfect. Sometimes the best solution is not the one prescribed, but the one discovered. Observation, patience, and thinking creatively, those are tools that can solve problems no one else can."
As the human worked, the rival faction grew more desperate.
They tried to interfere subtly, introducing misleading information and testing the human with unexpected complications. But he anticipated many of these challenges. Using logic, creativity, and insight gained from experience across worlds, he adapted to every situation. The daughters learned from this as well. Lyra noticed how he remained calm under pressure, how he prioritized problem-solving over confrontation. Nerea observed how he considered long-term consequences rather than seeking immediate praise. These lessons became invaluable to the daughters, who realized that their time in distant worlds had prepared them to understand not just human ingenuity, but the philosophy behind it. One evening, as the sun set over the capital, the Empress walked through the central chamber. She observed the human and the daughters working side by side, their hands moving confidently over data displays. The rival faction, watching from behind the scenes, could only look on, unable to find fault.
Your Majesty,
the human said softly as she approached,
the network is stable. I have identified vulnerabilities and optimized routes without disrupting operations. The improvements should last for decades.
The Empress studied the results carefully. Charts and simulations confirmed his words. Every sector, every planet, every line of communication had been accounted for. Where the Empire had struggled for generations, he had succeeded in days.
"This is remarkable," she said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "You have not only solved the problem, but also demonstrated a method of thinking that could transform the Empire."
"It was a challenge of observation and reasoning, Your Majesty. I simply applied what I have learned from experience. Sometimes, the smallest insights can have the largest impact." The rival faction could not ignore the results. Their whispers of doubt faltered under the evidence. They realized that the human's success was not luck or trickery. It was careful reasoning, combined with courage and insight. The daughter stepped forward. "We have seen how he works," Nerea said firmly. "Not only does he solve problems, but he teaches others to think differently. The Empire can grow stronger by learning from him, not opposing him." The Empress smiled, seeing the wisdom in their words. She knew that this was more than a test of intelligence. It was a demonstration of character. The human had shown patience, creativity, and moral clarity. He had achieved success without coercion or manipulation, inspiring respect rather than fear. At the conclusion of the trial, the Empress addressed the council and the Empire's ministers. "The trial of knowledge and strategy is complete," she said. "The human has demonstrated not only his ability to solve challenges beyond our understanding, but also the principles of integrity, ingenuity, and perseverance. Let this serve as a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies in creativity, wisdom, and courage, rather than force." The room fell silent, then erupted in quiet murmurs of acknowledgement. Some ministers, still reluctant, nodded in recognition. Others whispered their awe, finally accepting that the human had achieved what had been declared impossible. The human, however, did not bask in praise. He quietly gathered his materials and prepared to leave the chamber. The Empress approached him. "You have done more than I could have imagined."
Your work will change the Empire.
He smiled, his eyes calm.
I have only done what I could, Your Majesty. The real change comes from those who continue to use it wisely.
The daughters stood beside him, pride and respect shining in their eyes. They had learned lessons, not only in strategy and intellect, but in patience, collaboration, and moral courage. Together, they had demonstrated that progress need not come through domination or fear, but through understanding and thoughtful action. Even the rival faction, forced to confront their own limitations, began to see the value in these lessons. Slowly, they began to adopt the changes the human had introduced, realizing that resistance was no longer practical or desirable. The Empire had begun to evolve, not through force or fear, but through cleverness, compassion, and insight. As the sun set behind the palace towers, the Empress looked out over the city. She saw citizens moving confidently through the streets, traders communicating efficiently across systems, and scholars collaborating with renewed energy. The human had not only solved the trial, but it sparked a transformation that would endure far beyond his presence. And somewhere in the quiet of her chambers, she allowed herself to hope. Hope that her daughters, the human, and the lessons they had brought could lead the Empire into a new era, one defined not by fear or tradition, but by intelligence, courage, and the unyielding spirit that had made humanity extraordinary. The trial was complete, the rival faction had been tested, and the Empire had been reminded of what was possible when courage met ingenuity. And as the stars shimmered above the capital, the Empress realized that this was only the beginning of a journey that would stretch across the galaxy, guided by lessons learned from a human who had dared to challenge the impossible. The palace was quiet in the early morning, bathed in soft light that shimmered off the crystal towers. The Empress stood at the highest balcony, looking across the city and beyond, where countless ships moved through the orbiting lanes. The air was calm, yet charged with a sense of possibility. The events of the past months had changed everything. The return of her daughters, the influence of the human, and the subtle transformation of the Empire itself. Her daughters approached her, walking lightly across the balcony. Neria's steps were confident, steady, shaped by years of survival and the lessons she had learned during her absence. Lyra, younger but equally perceptive, followed closely, her eyes bright with curiosity and hope. Together, they represented the future of the Empire, a bridge between tradition and possibility, between what had been lost and what could now be gained. "Mother," Neria said softly, "the Empire is listening now."
People are paying attention. They see what we have seen.
It is no longer just your authority. They are ready for change. The Empress nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon.
Yes, my daughter, but change is never simple.
There will always be those who resist, who fear the unfamiliar. We must guide them, and we must be patient.
The human appeared then, walking up the marble steps with quiet confidence. He carried nothing but his presence, yet his calm determination radiated through the air. He had been a teacher, a strategist, and a guide, yet he never demanded recognition or authority. He simply acted with integrity and wisdom, and the Empire had begun to follow, naturally. "You have done much already," the Empress said, turning to face him. "But the journey is not yet complete." The Empire still must find its balance between tradition and innovation, between caution and courage.
He bowed slightly. "I understand, Your Majesty."
"I have only shown what can be done. The real work comes from those who will carry it forward." In the days that followed, the Empress and her daughters worked alongside the human to implement lasting changes. Communication networks were strengthened, trade routes optimized, and education systems improved to encourage creativity and critical thinking. Citizens, previously hesitant to question tradition, began to explore new ideas. Scholars collaborated across planets, sharing discoveries and insights with unprecedented efficiency. The human's presence was no longer seen as unusual or threatening. People admired his ingenuity, but more importantly, they understood the principles behind his actions: patience, observation, creative thinking, and moral courage. Even the rival faction, once outspoken and suspicious, began to adopt some of his approaches. They realized that resistance alone could not sustain the Empire. They had to embrace progress. The daughters played a critical role in this transformation. Neria focused on strategy and logistics, guiding sectors of the Empire to work together efficiently. She drew on her experiences in distant worlds, blending lessons from human ingenuity with alien systems.
Lyra concentrated on communication and education, ensuring that knowledge was accessible and that the Empire's citizens could understand and participate in decision-making.
Through their combined efforts, the Empire began to flourish in ways the Empress had never imagined. Ships moved faster between worlds, resources were distributed fairly and efficiently, and disputes that had lasted generations were resolved through negotiation and insight rather than authority alone. The human's influence had not erased tradition. It had strengthened it by showing where flexibility and innovation could enhance the old ways. One afternoon, the Empress called a council meeting. The room was filled with ministers, scholars, and representatives from across the Empire. The atmosphere was tense, though respectful. For years, these meetings had been dominated by rigid hierarchy and fear of error. Today, there was curiosity, anticipation, and cautious optimism.
The Empress addressed the council. "We have witnessed remarkable achievements in recent months."
The return of my daughters was only the beginning. Their experiences, combined with the guidance of our guest, have opened new doors for our Empire. But progress is a responsibility, not a gift. Each of us must work together to ensure that the future is bright for all citizens, not just a few. The human stepped forward, speaking not as a leader, but as a participant.
"I have done what I could, but the Empire itself has the power to shape its destiny. The lessons we have learned about collaboration, observation, and thoughtful action are tools you can all use."
The future belongs to those who act wisely and courageously. Some ministers nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in his words. Others, still cautious, remained silent, weighing the implications. The daughters, standing beside the Empress, watched carefully. They understood that this was a delicate moment. The Empire was ready to evolve, but only if they guided it with patience and wisdom. Over the next weeks, practical applications of these lessons began to appear. Trade agreements were renegotiated with neighboring systems, creating partnerships that strengthened resources and knowledge. Scholars from distant worlds shared innovations, improving technology and infrastructure. Citizens who had previously felt powerless were encouraged to contribute ideas, fostering a sense of inclusion and shared purpose. The human, ever quiet and observant, continued to provide insight where it was needed, but he never sought recognition. He taught by example, demonstrating that action guided by principle and thoughtfulness could achieve more than command or force. The daughters learned from him every day, their confidence and wisdom growing alongside the Empire's progress. One evening, the Empress walked through the palace gardens alone, reflecting on all that had changed. The air was fragrant with blooming flowers, and the sky above was streaked with the colors of distant nebulae. She realized that she had been holding tightly to the past, shaped by loss and grief. But now, the past and present were connected in a way she had never expected. Her daughters were home, the Empire was thriving, and the human had shown that even the smallest beings could inspire vast change. She looked up at the stars, thinking of the countless worlds beyond her own. The universe was vast, full of unknown possibilities and challenges. Yet she no longer felt fear. She felt hope, a quiet, steady flame that promised a future defined not by sorrow or rigidity, but by courage, ingenuity, and collaboration. The daughters joined her in the garden, their hands brushing against hers. "Mother," Lyra said softly, "we have learned so much, not just about surviving, but about shaping the world we live in. We can take the lessons we have learned and guide the Empire forward."
Neria nodded. "We have seen what is possible.
Now it is our responsibility to continue it." The human appeared then, standing slightly apart, observing the family and the empire he had helped transform. He said nothing, only smiled, gently. His work was not complete. He could always do more. But he understood that true impact came not from control, but from guidance and inspiration. The Empress turned to him. "You have given us more than we could have imagined. Your presence has reminded us of the power of courage, wisdom, and ingenuity. The Empire owes you a debt beyond measure."
The Empire owes me nothing. I only hope that what we have done together will continue, long after I am gone. That is all the reward I need. In the weeks that followed, the Empire continued to flourish.
The daughters assumed leadership roles, guiding sectors with insight, compassion, and strategy. Citizens participated in governance and innovation, bringing ideas forward that strengthened communities. Scholars collaborated openly, sharing discoveries without fear. Even the rival faction, now tempered by experience, contributed to progress, realizing that cooperation produced greater results than opposition. The human prepared to depart, his mission complete. He had returned the daughters, guided the Empire through a period of transformation, and inspired a new way of thinking. He left quietly, his vessel gliding into the stars without fanfare. The Empress watched him go, her heart filled with gratitude and awe. "Will he return?" Lyra asked softly, watching the starship disappear. "Perhaps," the Empress replied. "But even if he does not, he has left a legacy that will endure. He has shown us what is possible. That is enough." As night fell over the capital, the city sparkled with lights, each one representing lives touched by change. The Empress stood with her daughters, looking out over a world that had grown stronger, wiser, and more hopeful. She knew challenges would continue to arise, but she also knew that her daughters and her empire were ready. They had learned that courage, ingenuity, and collaboration could shape destiny in ways she had never dreamed. And in that quiet, shining moment, she realized the truth she had come to understand over these extraordinary months. Humanity was extraordinary, not because of strength or technology alone, but because of its ability to adapt, to think creatively, and to act with courage and principle even when the odds were impossible. The universe stretched endlessly beyond them, full of mystery and possibility, but for the first time in decades, the Empress did not fear it. She knew that with her daughters the lessons they had learned, and the inspiration of a single human who had changed everything, the Empire was ready to embrace the future and to shine among the stars. And so a new era began, an era of understanding, ingenuity, and hope, guided not by fear or rigid tradition, but by courage, wisdom, and the unshakable belief that even the smallest beings could shape the destiny of galaxies.